Well, welcome to the PP&C Fundamentals and Integration course that we put together and we mentioned in the introduction. Let me kind of define how this course is going to unfold in terms of beginning to end. As I mentioned earlier, it was an end-to-end perspective. So we're going to start way back at the beginning. Where does the money come from? You can't have a project without funding. It doesn't come from the sky, whether you're from an agency or you're from a contractor. Funding has to be provided. And so we're going to start with how that's authorized and appropriated and actually gets into where funding can be provided and work can be performed. So we'll move from there, and we're going to talk a little bit about how do you propose? Well, if money becomes available, contractors have to bid on the work that's going to happen. Sometimes it could be a fixed, it could be a sole source solicitation, but generally it's a competition. And we're going to take the perspective of how you go through a competition and get a proposal and ultimately an award. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about the industry perspective. Whereas an agency is focused on cost management and funds management, a contractor like Lockheed or Boeing or Northrop or the bigger companies, they're focused on profit. And so we're going to talk a bit about how those key metrics of cost and obligations and funding and sales and orders and income and margin, how all those relate to making a decision on what to deliver, when to deliver it, how it's best positioned to meet their objectives for the company ultimately. We're going to talk primarily, for the bulk of this program, this course is focused on planning and control. So we're going to talk about the planning steps on how you generate a plan that's hopefully executable. And then the execution or the implementation, which is the control side, is the monthly rhythm of gathering the data, statusing the activities that are on the schedule and on the cost and on the budget, looking at how to generate the reports. What does it all mean? So we're going to look at the analysis and show the difference between analysis and assessment, because they are different. And the assessment, then, when it's put together, is an integrated story between all the functions within the PP&C community. Part of the control process, we go into a series of modules after that look at each one of the key functions and how they relate to analysis and assessment. As I had mentioned earlier, there's three key things that are takeaways from this course, I think. One is that the project integrator or business manager is focused on bringing all the things together relative to the business of the project, from procurements to proposals to estimates to schedules to cost to workforce to funding to obligations, cost phasing, all of those kind of things into one story presented to the management team. And so we start to look at each one of those individual functions and what they do as part of the analysis and assessment and how it ultimately comes together at the end. So we'll look at scheduling and risk and EVM and contracts and those kinds of activities. And then finally, how do you tell the story? How do you put all that together to effectively communicate that message? Then we talk at the end of the course is about it's just a summary of trying to capture as best we can the key takeaways of this course. But there's one module that I would like you to pay particular attention to, and it comes at the end, but it'll serve you well as you go forward in whatever career path you have in this field. And that is, it's a series of questions. We call it the checklist, but really it takes every one of those functions I just alluded to and says, hey, if you're looking at these kinds of activities and you see it from month to month, what questions do you ask? What are you looking for? What's a red flag? How do you discern between what's important and what's not important and what the trends are telling you? And so there are key things that come to light every time. And you want to be in a position to understand them. Some are significant, some are not. Some may mean something in 1 month, but where they don't mean something in another month. It could look like it's a bad story, but if you understand what happened and you realize you have a workaround, maybe it's not such a bad story. On the other hand, something may look rosy, but you realize that underneath it, things are not really coming together well. And understanding those questions and what to ask and what to look for is what you'll find in that checklist. Finally, there's a case study that we put at the end. And again, it tries to capture all the kinds of things that we've talked about in this course and presents a situation that the project is faced with certain conditions. And we'd like you to look through that, and we'll talk about what is some options and maybe what's the best option given some considerations. This whole course is focused through the eyes of what we're calling a business manager or a PP&C integrator or a project control manager. It's the individual that ties all this together, that brings all this into one story. It avoids the siloed perspective of each one of the individual functions. Picture yourself as a project manager or a technical leader or a decision maker on the project. They don't need 5 or 6 stories that may or may not be consistent because a certain function has looked at certain things in different ways. They need a consistent, integrated, focused story. And that's one of the underlying themes of this course throughout, is what is integration and how does it come together in order to tell the right story for the project team. So anytime you see the word or you see us talk about integration or business management or PP&C related activities, we're talking about the same thing, the same term, the same function. The integrator is not a separate job, all right? It is the leader of all of those functions as it relates to the project. The project has to look to some source, some individual that puts it all together, and that's the integrator. But they're also the analyst, because they're the ones that are looking at the monthly data. They're the ones that are putting together the story. They're the ones that are looking at the trends, putting together the assessment, answering the questions, and the things that support that story ultimately at the end. As I mentioned earlier, and we'll probably mention a number of times throughout this course, that this is designed to provide a comprehensive end-to-end perspective, so that there's a flow. So each of the modules are not helter-skelter. This is how a project unfolds from beginning to end. We'll look at the formulation phase, we'll look at the implementation phase, and how all these activities come together to support the project from mission success or aircraft delivery or whatever it is that the project is designed to deliver. One of the things that you want to be cognizant of, and environments tend to change clearly, but there's a lot of focus now, and it probably will be for some time, that our environment is very dynamic. The job you are in today may not be the one you have tomorrow. And in fact, the company you're with today may not be the one that you're with tomorrow. Some maybe you may be on the same career path and you're very comfortable with where you are and you think that you're going to be doing that for your career. Maybe not going to happen. Maybe you don't have control of it. So the more you understand about the whole dynamic of what this course is about, from all the different perspectives of what a business manager is focused on and is trying very hard to deliver to the project, is in your interest to do. And so this will help you position yourself to be more successful. It'll give you a wider view of what you're doing. Some of this stuff, much of this stuff may not be able to take back to your desk right now and have it do your job, but you'll start to see how it all comes together and how the dots align, so where you can get a better perspective of what project controls and business management really is. All the agencies, not just DoD, not just NASA, all of them are facing the reality of reduced budgets. It's just the side of the times. In fact, most of the times it is. They always like to make sure that they get the best bang for the buck and the best competitive edge. And so we're faced with that right now. There's always increased pressure to do more with less, and that's not going to end shortly. That's going to continue for probably the majority of your careers. Have been that way for most of mine. But we also need to be flexible and adapt the processes that you employ right now to all the different array of projects. Some are big, some are small, some are short-term, some are long-term. Some are sole source, some are involved multiple contractors, some involve sub-tier contractors. All of that is very dynamic. And you have to be positioned to understand that, how they all come together. And we're trying to present that picture throughout this course. One of the things that is reasonably new, but is going to grow pretty rapidly, I think, in all agencies as time goes on, and that is the commercialization, to where the government is going to purchase the services rather than own the asset. I think that's a major shift. And it's not just NASA, but it's DoD and other agencies. You look at the advent of SpaceX and Blue Origins and many of the other companies that are now very strong in the industry. It's a move toward commercialization, and you need to adapt that. You need to adapt your processes and your infrastructure within your company to be successful to make that happen. And the business professionals play a key role in doing that, because you have to be multifunctional. You can't just be one job. You got to look at different things. You have to wear many hats, and maybe one hat one day and one hat another day. And you have to be positioned to know when the hats change and be able to do that, because ultimately the sign of a success is when the business professionals are strategic partners with the technical and project team. And that's what we're trying to give you some insight as to how to make that happen. The next couple of charts are just the way reality is. We start out planning a project, and we assume we're going to hit the budget, we're going to hit the schedule, everything's going to turn out good, all the contractors will come on board at the right time. We're squeezed for money, but we think we can do it. We might have some workarounds, but life isn't like that. Maybe funding doesn't show up at the right time. Maybe our workforce doesn't come on board when we think it's going to. Other kinds of things happen, and there's pressure to do certain things to sell the project, to get it funded, and then reality sets in.
I think I can offer an input here. Something I learned early in my career is that engineers and project managers are can-do people. They want to solve a problem. They consider it a personal challenge before they got to admit that there's some problem going on in the project. So if you look at that last chart, you'll see that, that there's your plan going along the bottom and on the top, and then below is your outcome, whether it's schedule being lost, whether it's funds being spent, whether it's dollars not coming in on time, whether it's more risk being assumed, whether it's less value being achieved for the dollar. The project manager is the last thing he wants to do is have to go tell the boss that, oh, we're in trouble. I need money. I need schedule. I need something. So I learned early on that the project managers are great. In my experience, it just comes from NASA. And the NASA gets a lot of accolades for the things that they do, but they get a lot of trouble. And it doesn't always make all the newspapers all the time, or the aerospace stories, if you will. But yeah, the last thing they want to do is, so it's your job as the business manager, as the project integrator, to determine which information is coming from which perspective of one of the several different attributes in PP&C, and which is the most accurate story at the time. For the first half, for 1 year, it might be the schedule person is telling the most accurate story. The next year may be the EVM person, and it could be the risk person as you get farther along in the project. So you got to know where the most truthful information is, because it's not necessarily coming from the project manager, because he doesn't want to admit a problem until he's got it already solved.
Having said all that, and I know, I've had the same experience that Bill just alluded to, and part of our job as the business of the business is to provide that perspective that's more balanced, focused on conducting the business within the funds and schedule that we have, and making sure that that comes to pass. So let's really get to the core of what project controls, PP&C, business integration, call it what you want, is. Project or program planning and control is planning and control. And they're two very distinctive functions within a project, whether it's NASA, where you call project formulation, and control being implementation, or in the DoD world, it could be preliminary design, final design. Those kind of tasks, they reflect the same set of activities that you have to go through to have a sound and executable project. And so planning is the first step of that. It is when all of the things that are necessary to create a cost and schedule integrated plan that is risk informed is the objective of the planning phase. So you do your initial cost estimates, you break the work into your WBA, your work breakdown structure. So you have specific controls where you control accounts that capture that cost. You set up your cost accounts so that you can capture cost and schedule and budget and performance information at that WBS level. You look at what your level one requirements are. You develop your integrated master schedule from the top down. So you have a master schedule, you have an intermediate schedule, you have detailed schedules, you have working schedules. All of those must be vertically and horizontally integrated. You look at what we'll call, and we'll talk about later, is a joint confidence level, which is a 70% feeling that you can actually hit the cost and schedule, and we'll show you how that's all done. All of those things are part of the planning phase. Decide what your acquisition strategy is. Are you going to do it in-house? Are you going to go out and outsource out certain things? Are you going to do a hybrid of those things? Which are you going to, what are you going to outsource? Is it going to be fixed price or cost plus? Are you going to a major supplier or two smaller suppliers? Those kinds of decisions are all generated and made in your planning process in the formulation phase. Do you have to do EVM on this project? And if you do, how are you going to set that up? What is your plan for doing that? How are your control accounts going to reflect the performance that you have to have in order to show progress on the project? This is all part of the planning phase. And so one of our modules talks about each step of that process, all the functions and what they do and how they play into having an effective planning phase. And the output of your planning phase as it relates to business is an executable plan, which means that your costs and your schedule are all integrated going forward. So that is your planning phase. This is kind of just what I alluded to of what happens. Now, the planning phase is not just linear. It's iterative until you're comfortable with what happens. So when you put it all together initially, that's your preliminary plan. But then you look and you fold your risk in. You look at when funding is more reasonably likely to happen. How quick can your workforce really come on? When do you really need them? When can you get contracts in place with your vendors? So all these things have an ebb and flow as you go through the planning process. And when it's ultimately done, and that is now your plan, you are now done with your planning phase. Now, that could take on small projects from 1 month to several months. It could take from a year to 2 years on bigger projects, and even longer on very long projects. So it's not something that happens real quick, but the process follows that same pattern. Integration and control is the monthly rhythm I've mentioned before of what happens the rest of the way. So you produce the plan initially. That was your integrated cost and schedule plan. That is your executable plan. So now you have to track to them. So every month you have a cycle. It'll continue right on through delivery and even up to closeout, depending on what your mission is. And so control then, and we're going to talk quite a bit about this as we go forward, but as an introduction to it, it starts with your data capture. So every month you get all your schedule updates, your cost updates, input from your subcontractors and other suppliers that you have, all the relevant information that happens during the course of the month, and you compare it to the plan that you set. So reports are generated and you sort of start looking at those things. Out of that comes trends. So as you go through every month by month by month by month, you're looking at trends, you're looking at how things came along that were supposed to happen. What did they happen? Are you ahead or behind? What did you do for what you said you were going to do? All of that's part of your monthly process of control. And that leads to an analysis, which I just mentioned, but also what does it mean? And we're going to talk about analysis in detail later, but it's essentially is the explanation, is what happened. And then the assessment is what does it mean? And we're going to look at examples and hear a lot of, more detail on that as we go forward. But this is essentially the key elements of planning and control. Planning is the executable plan, getting it all ready and issued out. And then the control is monitoring that plan, adjusting that plan, and managing that plan through the life of the project or the mission. Project controls, or PP&C, is made up of several elements. It's got cost estimating, it's got risk management, it's got scheduling, it's got workforce, it's got resource, it's got data management in many cases. It's got all of your budget and funds and obligations and EDM and risk. All those different functions come together into an integrated way to make up the planning and control part of the process. And that's what the focus of this course is about. It's integrating all of those elements to tell a unified story so that they all come together instead of individual pieces that may be at variance. And integration is the operative word for making that happen. So let's take a look at why that's important. As I said, these are the various functions that you'll run into. Some are more involved than others, depending on what the mission is and where you are in the process. But they all need to be one unit going forward. So the integrator, the business manager, well, let's start by calling him the business manager. What that individual does is gets all the information from each one of those to flow into one story so that there's not contradictions. The scheduling department or the scheduler on the project doesn't say we're ahead or behind, but yet the cost and funding or workforce says we're okay or we're ahead. Or maybe the schedule says we can do these things, but we haven't hired the people yet. Maybe the workforce hasn't staffed up to where it's supposed to be. Or maybe a cost estimate is being performed, but if it's not integrated with the schedule, how does it align? How does it know that you can do it for that if you don't really know what the schedule is? So all these stories have to align. And that's the key role of the business manager, is to make sure not only do these processes happen, but they're happening in an integrated fashion. The project team doesn't need to do all that. They look for somebody to do these activities to make the story a viable one. So why is that important? And I think ultimately it's all, as I had mentioned many times, and you'll hear us all say it many times, we're looking for the single source of truth, which is really what's really happening. It's our job to analyze and assess all the performance and activities that are happening on all fronts, including technical. How does the technical add or subtract from the risk? How is the technical meeting schedule objectives and things of that kind? And so we run into some of these problems along the way, and the business has to step up and do that. So, I mentioned earlier that we have a student here that is going to be asking some questions as they come up and as I talk. And I can see that he's got a question now. So, Stephen, why don't you shout out what you're thinking about?
I just recently started an internship at an aerospace company, and I noticed that a lot of the project managers and the engineers don't really pay much attention to what the business guys are saying because they're so focused on the technical side of things. Is that a normal thing throughout the industry, and how do you deal with that?
Yes, yes, it is a normal thing in some circles, and it's a little bit different on what perspective we're talking about. I think in the introduction, I had mentioned I had spent half of my career, about 20 years worth at for Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. Well, they're very focused on profit and earnings and cash flow. And so the objectives of hitting those targets are extremely important. And the technical and project management team come up through the ranks and know that that is a key success criteria. When you're in the civil service arena and you're working on where it's focused on cost and funds management, and there really is no profit, and cash flow is not the primary objective, what you're saying, Stephen, is very true. The project manager and the technical team don't pay a lot of attention to the business team because they're focused on the technical. As Bill mentioned a minute ago, they are go-getters. They are I can get this job done. I can name that tune in 5 notes. And they lose sight of the business, of the cost, of the schedule ramifications of some of those things. And I tell the story, and this is a true story. When I came down to the Jet Propulsion Lab for NASA, my my assignment was to create a business capability there. And so, as naive as it turned out that I was in the world of cost management instead of profit management, I tried to go to some of the meetings. Projects have review meetings all the time about status and technical stuff. And they looked at me like, "What are you doing here? Well, we don't need you. This is a technical meeting. And so thanks for coming, but we'll call if we need you." And they weren't being rude so much as this was not a business discussion because they're focused on technical problem, and they probably didn't want somebody either charging their program or maybe getting information that they would share outside that room. And so I said, "Well, I'm new and I have this job and I'd like to participate." So long story short, they ultimately said, "Well, okay, you can stay, but don't say anything and don't talk about what we say here." So I nodded, "Okay, sure enough." But as time goes on and I went to more and more of the meetings, I did start to make some comments and start asking questions on some of those checklist items that I talked about that we'll get to later. And some of them resonated quite well with the team. They said, "Oh yeah, maybe we should think about that," or "Yeah, we need to find out about that," or "I already thought that happened," or "I didn't think that was an issue." Those kind of things. And so they said, "Well, okay, well you can talk, you can participate, but just on the business stuff." And so again, as time went on, I get more involved and ask more of these kinds of questions because performance starts to be at variance to the plan. And the end result of that was that there was literally several times where, for some reason or other, I had a schedule conflict and I couldn't come to the meeting. They actually changed the meeting or canceled the meeting, rescheduled it. Again, it's not because I'm smart, it's because these issues are very relevant and they're important to mission success. If you lose sight of the schedule, you lose sight of the workforce. You can't do work without it all being integrated. And so that's kind of how it evolved at JPL, and it's how it's evolved throughout the industry now. And we want you to understand that and want you to step up. Don't sit at the back of the room, sit at the table and start asking these kinds of questions. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's a struggle, but you have to be able to do that. You have to have the mindset and the confidence to be able to do that. All right, these are just some things for you to think about. Is the integration is very dynamic, but you need a lot of cross discussion between all of these functions. As I mentioned, if you have a schedule, it's got to be consistent with the cost estimate. It's got to be consistent with your workforce. It's got to be consistent with your budget. It's got to be consistent when your suppliers are going to come online and be able to deliver the things that they got to deliver. If you are doing EVM, it's got to tie to your schedule and your workforce and your budget plan. Risk has to flow through all of the elements. You have elements related to schedule, you have elements of risk related to all of the elements that make up a schedule, both technical and business, all are important. And you need to be able to integrate that story. Budgets need to flow through the same things I've just mentioned and so forth. All of the things need to tie together to make a credible story. And you need to know that. And the business manager has the charter to do that. These are just some of the activities that go through in the planning phase to make sure that you do, in fact, have a cost and integrated schedule to get where it flows into the control side or the monthly activities of managing the project. So you want to make sure your assumptions are consistent. You want to make sure your suppliers are on board. You want to make sure your baseline is credible. You want to make sure your WBS and your organizational breakdown structure, OBS, is captures all the work that's inherent in the statement of work. We find that that's another problem that surfaces when you're doing your planning, and that is that, oh, by the way, we thought that our schedule and our work breakdown structure captured all the statement of work activities, but in fact it doesn't. So having this all integrated really captures some of those kinds of activities, ensures that you have the best plan going out of there. Schedule is perhaps the whole foundation of doing a mission in terms of getting it done on time and within budget. Lots of times you hear the adage that if you just manage the schedule, everything else falls into place. And there's a lot of truth to that. So you need to have a good schedule. And to have a good schedule, you got to have all those other elements that flow into that, that identify the things that could happen to make the schedule viable or not. And the integration allows that to move forward in a very fundamental way. Same with the cost estimate. You got to have a solid cost estimate. If you don't, then you could be too high, too low. You could be outside the competitive range. You might not even win in the first place. You might not have captured the risk entirely. You may have not captured the issues related to subcontracting. All of these uncertainties drive the cost. And so at joint confidence level, that is one of the deliverables from the formulation phase, the planning phase, captures those risks as it relates to cost and schedule. And we'll talk more about that later on. The technical scope has to flow through WBS because that's really what the scope is, what you're actually performing to. And so all this cross-discipline activities is absolutely imperative in order to have a successful mission at the end. And then cost control is that primary function that manages the cost and the budget and the workforce and the cost phasing and the things that go along with making sure that you understand the trends, that you can relate one to the other, that if things go really well, then turn really bad, well, what happened? What did you make a mistake? Is there certain things you have to understand that activities, when they don't come together well, what does it mean? How did it get like that? Could be just a rounding error. It could be just an error in input or something. You need to be able to understand what those kind of things, though they are. You know, I've heard and taught when I was coming up through the ranks that, a data point is a data point. 2 data points is a line. 3 data points is a trend. So as you go through and you get 3 or 4 or 5 months, you look at what happened in the last few months. You look what over 2, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, that kind of starts to tell the story. When things get out of phase, you need to understand why. You need to also compare other projects in the same kind of class. If a mission or if you're building an aircraft or whatever you're doing, if it's very similar to another one, you want to make sure that when one project can do certain things in some number of months of schedule or years, why is yours at variance to that? Doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you need to understand what that is. Because if integration is absent, you don't have it, then you've got very fragmented input and insight. Decision makers don't get the common story. They have variances from one story to the other, from one discipline to the other. Schedule may say they got a problem. Workforce may say we don't have a problem. So the baselines are inconsistent, and they may ultimately be not executable because of that. So decisions get delayed, margins get eroded, cash flow tends to be a problem, your credibility gets jeopardized, and you have issues related to cost overruns. It's behind schedule, and it makes our job problematic. So we can't be siloed. We have to be integrated. We'll talk about this one also later, but just by virtue of summary, This is what we're going to refer to throughout this course as the PP&C hierarchy. It's not linear. It's an activity that I've found, and I'm sure Bill's found, and others have found throughout their career, that a lot of the projects look to project controls, business management for gathering the data and putting out reports. And that's all. And what we are pushing incredibly hard, in fact, one of the courses that Bill put together for his CFO University was analysis and assessment. That's the core capability. That's where you want to focus your energy and your knowledge and your real benefit to the project and the institution. And so once you do data capture, that's great. Putting out reports shows what the performance is, shows what the activities are, what's happened during the course of the month. But the analysis compares the facts. It compares what happened, what got out of whack, what is the variance, what does it mean? That's what the assessment is. That is the indication of what the story is. It's the interpreting what the information is. Where analysis is understanding of the explanation of what happened, and the assessment is interpreting what does it mean. Is it a problem? Is it a potential problem? Is it something to keep an eye on? Is it really something that's got to be addressed right now? Is it leading to a possible risk in the future? And then you've got to be able to communicate that story. It's got to be very clear. It's got to be well thought out. It's got to be well drawn out as to what you're trying to articulate to the management team so you can empower them to make some insightful decisions. So the next few charts are just some things that I've tried to communicate to the folks that were in my division throughout my career. And they're kind of a compilation of my thoughts and Bill's thoughts. As you know, together we've got lots of years in this business as leadership. We're both executives in our functions, and we've experienced an awful lot. And so these are just some of the things you might want to consider from our perspective. And I think they're important, and I think they'll serve you well as you go into yours. First of all, what should you be thinking about? Not just what's there, it's what are you thinking about? How do you see the data and the information? What are you spending your time doing? Are you just running reports, or are you looking at the information and making analysis and assessments from it? What questions should you be asking? And not just asking, but getting the actual answers to them. And do they make sense? And are they consistent throughout other projects? How do you perceive the risk? Is it minor? Is it major? Is it actually a showstopper? Could it be safety of flight related kinds of issues? All of these kinds of things help you understand how to support the project in the institution as it relates to the business of the business. Think of yourself maybe as a review board. I still serve on some review boards from time to time, and I'm not that familiar with the project. So I want to ask some questions that kind of come to my mind as I hear the people talk about what the status is and what they're trying to do. And so you want to look at that on your own project. What should I be thinking? What should I be asking to make sure that I got a handle on what's going on? And then what steps do you need to take going forward to clear these things that are in your mind? How do you know when something's reasonable? So we're going to try to give you some insight into some of that. What contributions do you feel that you need to make in order to be a valuable asset to the project? Think back to the story I just told about adding some values that related to schedule and cost and estimating workforce, those kind of things that they may not be thinking about because they're focused on their technical accomplishments and getting the job done, and they know what to do. They're engineers. They just figured it out, but maybe some of the things that relate to business haven't been thought through as much. So what are you contributing to make sure that makes you an equal partner there? And then how do you go about doing it? How do you approach the project? How do you get to be a strategic partner? We'll talk a bit about that. And then again, what kind of questions should you be asking? This is some of the perspectives that I have. The others are considerations. This is just kind of a perspective. One is you have to be credible. Is in fact more important than being right. That's a hard thing for people to swallow. Sometimes they feel because they're in a certain job certain function, or if they're a supervisor or manager, hey, they got to know everything. And so they say things when they're not really sure about what it is. And so the project kind of moves forward on it if they take action on it. But if it turns out to be not thought out very well, it happens to be wrong, then you lose credibility and you will never get it back. It'll take a long time to do that. So you need to be credible. You need to make sure that you have thought through the right things, you've asked the right questions, you've done the right research, you've talked to your teammates, and you're presenting the information that needs to be done, and you're answering the question correctly. Even if the answer is not sure, I'll find out from Bobby or Sally, whoever's on your project that can get me that information, and we'll get right back to you. So don't jump to conclusions. Don't state opinions as if they're facts. This is a very common problem. People have opinions about things and they assume that they're factual. They're not. They may be, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So make sure that what you're relating to the project is factual, not just your opinion. The key thing to remember through sorting through all this myriad of data, it's not about what happens, but it's about what you do with what happens. And that's the value you bring to the project. Another perspective that I've had is about influence the outcome. If you're not going to influence the outcome, you're wasting your time. Nobody needs you if you're not going to have some impact on what happens. So half of your time is probably adjusting to just the environment and the processes that happen. And the other is shaping what you want that environment to be, how you can contribute your knowledge and the value that you bring to impact the project in a useful way. And leadership and insecurity are not compatible. So if you're uncomfortable or you're just not feeling that you really are a strategic partner, that's a problem. And you need to try to work through that. The other bullet in that chart brings up a story that I just dwell on for a second, but it's a meaningful one. It's actually shaped a lot of the activity that I've done and how I've kind of formed how I present myself to projects and things over the years. And that is focus on what you know is there, not just on what you can see. And what I mean by that is I think back to my first day, literally my first day in an English course when I was at college, way back in the light years away. The professor asked us all to take out a piece of paper and write down what he showed us. And what he showed us was a picture of a national park. Could be any one of them. With mountains, snow-capped mountains, blue sky, pine trees and meadows and all that kind of stuff. And he said, describe this. You got 15 minutes. And so we all wrote down what we thought. And I thought I did pretty good. I took English before, so I knew how to write an essay. So I kind of did what I thought was pretty good. So he collected them all and he just randomly read through them all. And he said, not one of you did a good job here. I'm sure everybody's thinking, wow, I thought I did pretty good. And what he said was, nobody in this class talked about the fish in the lake. Nobody talked about the deer in the meadow. Nobody talked about the birds in the trees that are lined this whole meadow and up and down the mountainside. Nobody talked about the butterflies that are on all those flowers out there that you see in this meadow. They're there. You've been to those places. You've lived your life. You've learned things in your field. And so rely on them. Leverage all the things you know, not just what's in front of you. And that's part of that is asking and then getting answers to all those questions that I mentioned a while back. And we'll get into more of that later on. These are just some perspectives, and you can read from these. Are just kind of, hey, this is what got me where I am. It can serve you well too. It's not necessarily about what you do. It's about who you are. That's what makes credible. That's the reputation there. That's when the team will rely on you and count on you for the right information. As I just mentioned in that story I just told, leverage all the skills, not just the technical ones, not just the ones that are at your fingertips. Don't be a crusader. I feel that, people that come in on a white horse don't make it. They get burned at the stake. You can't change the world. Go with the flow, but make your value important. Influence the outcome and what you can do, because it's all about the balance. Sometimes you got to compromise. Sometimes you got to hold the line, and you're the line when it comes to business. And this is just capturing those things that I've talked about. So keep in the back of your mind. All right. So that concludes the first module. So we had a little bit of by way of introduction and kind of what the course is about. And we've walked you a little bit through the modules and what to expect. And then what project control is and what integration is and the importance of all of that and some key perspectives and considerations. So now Bill is going to take you through the next module, which is where does the money come from? It starts the whole game. You can't do work without money. And so he's going to tell you how it shows up. So take a break and we'll come back with module number 2.